Hello and welcome to Neo Psychology with me, your teacher, Mr. Neo, the channel where I make psychology lessons for my wonderful students. Today we're looking at lesson 18, types of observation, evaluation. Last lesson we had a look at the different types of observations, and today we're going to evaluate them. Let's have a look at the starter, shall we? In each of the studies described below, decide whether the study involved observations that were A, naturalistic or controlled, B, overt or covert, C, participant or non-participant, or whether you think they're ethically acceptable. Pause the video now, have a look at the four, and then give your answers. Let's have a look at number one. Mary Ainsworth studied infant relationships with their parents. This was known as the strange situation. Infants and a caregiver were placed in a room with a predetermined and fixed set of toys. They were observed through a one-way mirror, so the infants wouldn't be disturbed by the observer's presence. Caregivers gave informed consent. First of all, I would say that it could be argued, but this is definitely a controlled environment, okay? So it's not in their natural setting. The room may look quite natural to them, but it is in a controlled environment because it probably is in a lab. Overt or covert, it depends on which perspective you're looking at. From the perspective of the parent, it's certainly overt because they've given informed consent, so they're fully aware they're in an experiment. But from the child's perspective, they don't know they're in an experiment. So from their perspective, you might argue that it's covert. And participant or non-participant, it's non-participant. The researcher isn't part of the experiment. They're not acting as one of the participants. Number two, Middlemist in 1976 observed men's behavior in a toilet. Weird study, but why not? It's interesting. First of all, naturalistic or controlled. It's got to be naturalistic. It's in a toilet. It's in a normal environment where you would normally do your business. Overt or covert. I'm assuming it's covert. I don't think they will tell the individuals that they're doing an experiment in a toilet, but maybe it is overt. But I would assume it's covert. Participant or non-participant. That sort of depends on how the experiment's being laid out here. There isn't much more detail than that. Depends if they. It could be participant. Maybe they're standing in the urinal next to their participants, just pretending to be one of the people using the toilets. Maybe not. Maybe they're watching them from the outside, so it would be more of a non-participant. That's up for debate. Number three, Moore in 1922 spent weeks walking around New York, writing down everything he heard and uncovering some interesting exchanges between people he observed. Okay, naturalistic or controlled? I would say definitely naturalistic. It's in New York City. It's in the streets, okay? So it's going to be naturalistic. Overt or covert? This is covert. People aren't aware that he's observing them or writing down their behaviors. Participant or non-participant? This is participant. He's pretending to be another person on the streets, just walking around. Ethically acceptable? I think that's up to you. In some cases, it might be fine. It's in the public, so observations obviously need to be in public, but depending on what information you're finding out depends on whether it might be deemed ethically or unethical or unethically acceptable. And the last one, number four, Rosenhan in 1973 conducted a classic study on insanity. Sane individuals pretended to hear voices and were admitted to mental hospitals. While in hospital, they noted down the behavior of the staff in the institution and the patients. So in this example, naturalistic or controlled is a naturalistic experiment, okay? They pretended to be people with patients with schizophrenia and got admitted into a hospital. So it's in a natural environment. There's naturalistic because it's a mental health hospital or insane asylum as it was called back then in the 70s. Overt or covert, the staff weren't aware that people were pretending to be schizophrenic. So this is a covert. Participant or non-participant, this is participant. They're pretending to be one of the patients. They're pretending to be one of them. So this is participant, so they can see it from the inside. And finally, ethically acceptable. Do you think it's ethically acceptable? I'd say I think it's important that they got an insight into the mental health hospitals at that time because they were quite poor and quite awful in some cases. So the research was in good taste, but they were deceiving some of the nurses and doctors that were working there and potentially gave them a bad name. So either way you could say that. But on the whole, I think it is ethically acceptable, but you may disagree. Let's have a look at our learning objectives for today. Today, learning objective 1, we're going to discuss and evaluate naturalistic and controlled observations, looking at the strengths and weaknesses of that, as well as covert and overt observations, and then lastly, participant and non-participant observations. Let's get started on LO1. discuss and evaluate naturalistic and controlled observations. In all observations, so regardless of which observation we're looking at, we have learnt about naturalistic, controlled, covert, overt, and participant and non-participant. It is not possible to establish a cause and effect. What that means is, if you were to find that there was a positive relationship between two variables, to give an example, you could say exercise and sleep. If I was to observe different behaviors and people would tell me how many hours they slept versus how many hours of exercise they did, there might be a perfect correlation of straight up. So a perfect correlation showing, yeah, there's a 100% concordance. The more you slept, the more exercise you did, or the more exercise you did, the more you slept. The point of observations is, because it's an observation and not an experiment, what makes it an observation and not an experiment is the fact that you're not manipulating a variable. You're not manipulating the independent variable. Therefore, you can't come to cause and effect conclusions. You can be unsure if one variable is causing the other or the other way around. So it might be obvious to think, well, if you exercise more, you're more likely to sleep more, but it could be the more you sleep more might mean the more you exercise more as well. So there's two variables there that you're not sure which one's causing which. In order to find out which one's causing which, you'd have to do an experiment and manipulate one of the variables. For example, exercise. Make one group do lots of exercise and one group do no exercise, and then see how that affects sleep. Okay, and then you'd compare the two. We can't determine what variable is causing what effect. This is because we are not manipulating an independent variable. Naturalistic and controlled observations evaluation. Naturalistic observations tend to have high external validity insofar as findings can often be generalized to everyday life, as the behavior is studied within the environment where it would normally occur. Okay, so it's quite a natural environment. It's in the usual, so it's going to have high external validity, and the findings will be able to be generalized. That said, the lack of control over the research situation makes replication of the investigation difficult. There may also be many uncontrolled extraneous variables that make it more difficult to judge any pattern of behavior. So there's a lack of control, which is a weakness of naturalistic observations. In controlled observations, in contrast, it may produce findings that cannot be generalized to real-life settings. Because it's in a controlled environment, because you could say a piece of research is in a lab, for example, you might say that people might not act as themselves. They know they're being observed, therefore there might be demand characteristics, therefore the findings might not be able to be generalized to a real-life setting. However, extraneous variables may be less of a factor, so replication of the observation becomes easier because you've got controlled for those extraneous variables. Replication of the study is a factor and it can be done. Therefore, this is a positive, of course. And that's naturalistic and controlled observation evaluation, right? One strength and one weakness of each observation type is perfectly acceptable. Okay, think about this. Identify one thing you learned about naturalistic and controlled observations evaluation. What's one evaluative point you learned? Why do you think this is important, learning about this? How does this apply in real life? And do you have any questions? If you've got any questions, let me know, send me an email, put it in the comments, and I'll try and get back to you. Or maybe another student can get back to you. Okay, I'm ticking off learning objective 1. This is going to be a brief lesson today, discussing and evaluating naturalistic and controlled observations. Now we're going to have a look at covert and overt observations. In covert observations, so remember, covert is the one where you're undercover, okay? So they don't know you're watching. Covert and overt, I remember covert's got the word cover in it, so you're undercover. A little mnemonic device there. In covert observations, the fact that participants do not know they are being watched removes the problem of participant reactivity and ensures any behavior observed will be natural. This increases the validity of the data gathered. Of course, if people don't know they're being observed, then their behavior is going to be more natural. It's going to be natural behavior, and this increases the validity. What you're in fact measuring is true behavior. However, the ethical issues of covert observation studies may be questioned, as people, even in public, may not wish to have their behaviors noted down. So, As we know, in observations, they need to be in public, okay? You can't do observations in private places, okay? So I can't do an observation of somebody in their house, right? That's ethically unacceptable, right? Me being at their window, like, what's going on in there? Well, that's interesting. Not acceptable, not ethically acceptable. So if you were to do an observation, they usually have to be in public. However, even in public, it may be argued that some of these may be unethical. So for instance, shopping would generally be recognized as a public activity, but the amount of money people spend on a shopping trip is probably their own private business. Okay, so that's, you know, there might be things that aren't ethically acceptable even if they are in public. Say, for example, if I was standing at a pharmacy, outside a pharmacy or next to a pharmacy, yeah, that's a public area. But then if you're finding out what medications people are getting, or you get people to confirm their numbers and addresses, and you go, oh, I'm just going to write that down, I'm sure that's not a problem, I'm in public. No, that's not ethically acceptable. Okay, so there are weaknesses and strengths of covert. Overt, in this sense, overt observations are more ethically acceptable. So one strength of overt observations is they're ethically acceptable. With an overt observation, you've usually got informed consent. So you got consent from the participants to say that they're willing to take part in your experiment or your observation. But the knowledge participants have that they are being observed may act as a significant influence on their behavior and may result in demand characteristics. The fact that they've given you consent and they know they're being observed may result in them acting in a way that isn't natural. They may have demand characteristics. They may act differently from normal. They may give you behaviors that you want, or they might even give you behaviors that they don't think you want. But either way, they're not acting as themselves, and that makes it difficult to generalize the findings. So that's a weakness. And that's overt and covert observations evaluation. Again, think about, identify one thing you learned about covert and overt observations. Why do you think learning about covert and overt observations is important? And how does covert and overt observations apply in real life? When does it apply in real life? Again, if you've got any questions, let me know, write them down, send me an email or leave it in the comments. Right. Okay, so we have completed covert and overt observations. On to the final learning objective, discuss and evaluate participant and non-participant observations. Let's have a look. In participant observations, the researcher can experience the situation as the participants do, giving them increased insight into the lives of the people being studied. This may increase the validity of the findings. There is a danger, however, that the researcher may come to identify too strongly with those they are studying and lose objectivity. They might lose themselves and sort of familiarize themselves with those people. Some researchers refer to this as going native, when the line between being a researcher and being a participant becomes blurred. It's sort of like on those TV shows when undercover policeman goes and hangs out with a gang, and then the policeman sort of becomes part of the gang as well because he's been with them for so long and starts to familiarize himself with them and starts to be part of them. However, non-participant observations allow the researcher to maintain an objective psychological distance from their participants, so there is less danger of going native, so they can have an objective view of the whole thing as the whole experiment or observation. However, they may lose the valuable insight to be gained in a participant observation as they are too far removed from the people and behavior they are studying. Okay, so you do get some really great insight when you're on the inside. However, you may become so engrossed on the inside that you've gone native and you lose objectivity. However, you will be objective if you stay on there, if you're remaining on the outside. However, you may lose valuable insight. Okay, and here we go. I want you to just give this a go. Write down the answer, please. Identify 2 types of observations and state 1 limitation of each. You can go for naturalistic or controlled, you can go for covert or overt, or you can go for participant and non-participant. And then I want you to identify 1 limitation of each. So this might be a question in the research papers method in paper 2. They might give you a type of observation and then ask you what is a limitation or what is a strength. This question is asking you identify 2 types of observations and state 1 limitation of each. Okay, give yourself 5 minutes. Give that a go, please. And there's participant and non-participant observations, evaluation. There we go. Identify 1 thing you learned about participant and non-participant observations, evaluation. Why do you think it's important to learn about this? And how does it apply in real life? Any other questions? Again, like I said before, let me know. And there we go. That's learning objective 3, done participant and non-participant observations. So we've looked at all 6 types of observations, and we looked at the strengths and weaknesses. They all come with strengths, they all come with weaknesses. No one is better than the other because they've each got their draws and issues and pros. Here we go. Watch this video of David Rosenhan's experiment, being sane in insane places. So this was the number 4 in the starter. So this is David Rosenhan, and him and a few colleagues pretended to hear voices. And so they got admitted into a psychiatric hospital as someone with schizophrenia, and then they got to observe the behavior from the inside. It's called Being Sane in Insane Places. Have a little look at that. It's an interesting thing. Click the video to follow the link. It's a nice thing to watch. So, here's the question. A very famous observational study was conducted by David Rosenhan in 1973, investigating the problem of defining abnormal behavior. Rosenhan arranged for 8 pseudo-patients, so that's fake patients, people pretending to be ill, one of whom was himself, to present themselves individually to various psychiatric institutions in the US complaining of fake symptoms of mental disturbances. These symptoms including hearing voices. All 8 pseudo-patients were admitted and given a diagnosis of schizophrenia in remission in all but one of the cases. Once they had gained access, the observation began. Each patient, as they now were, stopped pretending to have symptoms and instead observed and recorded the daily life of the patients in the institution. So they pretended to have these symptoms before they got admitted in, and then once they were admitted, they acted perfectly normal as they always did. The usual ward routine interactions with the staff, etc. One notable finding was the way in which staff at the hospital behaved towards the researchers. Despite the fact that many of the genuine patients quickly realized that the pseudo-patients were fake, staff were slower to catch on. So the staff weren't very good at identifying who were the real patients and who were the pseudo-patients or the fake patients. Significant also was the way in which the behavior of the pseudo-patients was regarded by staff. Note-taking by one of the researchers was described as repetitive writing behavior in their patient notes, and pacing the corridors, which researchers often engaged in to ease their boredom, was interpreted as a sign of anxiety. In short, the normal behavior of the researchers was seen by staff at the various hospitals as symptomatic of the mental disorder they had been labelled with. So some of their normal behaviours that they would have done because they were acting normal once they were admitted started to be interpreted as problems with their psychosis, as part of their symptoms of their schizophrenia. So I want you to identify, is Rosenhan observation naturalistic or controlled, covert or overt, participant or non-participant? And then this study is seen as a powerful example of the influence that the label mental illness has on the way we view behaviour, but how valid is the method used? Identify 2 strengths and 2 limitations of the observational methods used in this study. Give yourself a couple minutes, pause the video, write the answer down, and I'm going to give you the answer now. So it was a naturalistic observation, as we discussed before. Covert, because it was undercover, because the participants didn't know, the staff didn't know, and it was participant. They were pretending to be one of the participants. Rosenhan and the other pseudo-patients were likely to gain data that was high in validity and insight, given that they became part of the group they were observing. Okay, they became one of the service users, one of the individuals with mental health problems. The fact that observations were made in real hospitals also meant that the finding could be generalized to other similar settings. These are strengths, these are all good things, right? These are all good things of the observation. However, Rosenhan and his colleagues may have risked identifying too far of the patients they were studying, as in going native. There are also ethical issues in the fact that they deceived staff. who thought they were genuine patients and did not ask for consent to conduct the study beforehand. Okay, so they were making notes, referencing members of staff in the hospital, nurses and doctors. So this is an ethical issue because they were deceiving them. They thought they were real, but they weren't. And this becomes issues of consent as well, because of course they didn't consent because it was a covert observation. And there we go. That is our lesson done for today. The next lesson is lesson 19, observational design. We look at the design, how you can design it, and different types of designs of observations. Okay, there we go. There we have it for today. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate you doing the lesson. Make sure you write the notes up for this. Thank you, and I'll see you again soon. Peace.
I'm feeling like Will, I feel like a prince, I'm feeling myself. I'm loaded with bills, cause I wasn't blessed with no Uncle Phil. Don't know how it feels, I wanted to flex, they told me to chill. I'm making a flip, my life is a flick, now load up the film.